This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support.
Hybrid Cloud Show, episode 55. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. Logan wrote in to us and asked us to talk about the recent Trivy compromises. Now, I think that was covered on 2.5 Admins in episode 292, so we'll throw a link to that episode in the show notes, and I don't propose that we get into the detail of the actual Trivy compromises, but the question Logan asked was more around CI/CD pipelines and whether you should be trusting GitHub Actions specifically in those pipelines. Can someone explain to me the GitHub Actions piece of the Trivy side of things so that we can talk about how that compares to other ways you might do CI/CD pipelines?
Sure. So GitHub is unique that, in far as I know, of the major CI/CD providers, things like GitLab, CircleCI, right? Those kind of big providers, that they actually have this open third-party marketplace called GitHub Actions Marketplace, I'm pretty sure. And all it allows you to do is set up a series of jobs and then say, yep, this is defined as my GitHub action, and then throw that in a repo basically into the marketplace for somebody else to use. So this can be extremely helpful if you're doing something that's more complicated, like maybe creating OCI container image. There are a couple steps in that, but they're all usually the same. There's not a lot of edge cases around that, depending on your language of choice. So somebody might publish that out there as a step, or it doesn't even have to be as big as that. It could just be as small as, given X, I produce Y, right? Given an OCI compliant image, I push it to the GitHub registry. That's what this thing is meant to be. And you can string these things along. Now, the important part to know is that these are third party, which means anybody can upload anything they want. And in this case, Aux Security uploaded their own action to have Trivy scan.
So this means that anyone using this action that was published by Trivy would be potentially vulnerable to Trivy or someone with control of Trivy's account doing something stupid in that action, like, I don't know, grepping for AWS access keys and then uploading them somewhere else.
Or every other secret could possibly have in your CI pipeline. Exactly.
I think the interesting thing about this is that whoever this actor was went after GitHub Actions. And I think one of the reasons for that is what they did in this attack was update a bunch of version hashes for the GitHub action. And there was no hashing that happened to validate the artifact that was produced or that artifact had changed. It's just everyone says, hey, I've got a GitHub action. I use Trivy action at whatever version. So if someone force pushes a new version there, you just arbitrarily pull that down. There is no checks and balances. And I think that was probably why they went over GitHub Actions as a very easy way to get access to a lot of CI/CD systems with no checks and balances around that.
So what you're saying there, Shane, is that if I have said that I want to use the Trivy action at 0.9 and Trivy publish a new version of 0.9, I just get that. And there's no checking that that is the 0.9 that I pinned to 5 years ago.
Yes, that is the case. And GitHub's answer to this was just use commit shaz for everything.
Yeah, sure, because that's the way that this works. People don't use version numbers. We're not human.
Yeah, so this is a pretty poor indictment of GitHub Action Security and a pretty poor indictment of the solution they offer to this.
Yeah, not our problem. Move along. Nothing to see here.
So let's talk about why that's different to how you might do this if you were using, I don't know, GitLab or whatever else, where it's a more similar to a script that you run as part of your CI pipeline.
Well, if you were doing this yourself, you would pull down that artifact once, as in trivy.exe or whatever it might be. You would validate the hash of that. You would keep that version around in your own internal artifactory or whatever it might be. And then you would update it on a regular but trusted and known cadence, and you would tell your developers to go and use the new version and that the old version was deprecated. So you wouldn't be vulnerable to someone arbitrarily changing that executable that was in your own internal artifact repository.
You can look at other tools that distribute software that solve this problem. Even something as simple as pip will force you to use a particular version number. And if you screw that up, you cannot wipe that version number and reproduce it. You have to bump the version number. So a mutable version number is not based on Git tags, which aren't immutable, is probably a fairly sensible default that they are not following.
Well, it is a pretty standard software release thing, right? That if you release and publish a version of a software with a given version number, that remains static and the same forever. And if you want to release 0.99.1, that is not the same as 0.99 and should not be the same as 0.99.
Yeah, and just to be clear as well, like GitHub, all the documentation around it, all the blog posts written about it, will tell people to distribute and release at tagged version numbers, not SHAs. So the idea that SHAs are somehow the way to fix this or the way people should have been doing things is just completely false. Everyone's been using version numbers and it's going to bite us, basically.
Well, it defies the entire point of GitHub having releases, right? I know they don't have releases for GitHub Actions, but they do for software. If not, this would literally be the equivalent of them telling me to go and pull an executable from this hash in a Git tree, which is not what they do at all.
So let's go to Logan's suggestion, which is that with all of the GitHub action compromises, that perhaps we should all just move to shell scripts for everything.
I don't know about that. I mean, in this case, this was a state-sponsored attack that happened to use this vector, or at least we strongly suspect it was a state-sponsored attack. If Trivi's org were truly compromised to that level, there is no reason that they couldn't have published a binary which you may have pulled down as part of your on-prem CI/CD pipeline or your shell script curling the latest version and not checked the hash properly and also been vulnerable to something like this. So I don't necessarily know that the method of running the pipeline is the problem here.
My immediate response to Logan's suggestion is, yeah, totally. Let's run shell scripts. I think for me, it's from years of kind of pent up frustration with CI/CD in general being broken for various reasons. I've had a lot of issues with GitHub Actions and the Docker Actions lately where they broke things and then roll back breakages to re-break my pipeline. So I'm very frustrated with it right now. But I think I'd agree with Gary. It's you're sort of shifting the needle a little bit here. I'm sure whatever shell script you're going to use is going to need to pull in third-party dependencies and maybe depend on base images and making sure that the patterns, the attack patterns you're kind of like worried about are covered, are still there, right? Just using shell scripts is not going to solve this. But I do agree, CI/CD sucks.
Well, yeah, you don't remove the requirement for having a decent bill of material in your build pipeline by changing the way that the build pipeline runs. If you wanted to do that, then you could continue using GitHub Actions, but build your own custom Trivi action, which has a static binary that you store in some kind of object storage somewhere and pull down. And that might be your trusted version. But then how do you know your trusted version that you pulled down, as I said earlier, 5 years ago, isn't also compromised or vulnerable in some way that you're unaware of? I think this just comes down to, as it often does, basic hygiene. And I say basic, fully realizing that this is actually a really complicated problem to solve with an entire industry around it. But it's all SBOM, right? Part of your SBOM was a GitHub action, which got compromised. And yeah, GitHub might have given some questionable advice around fixing or not fixing this that is contrary to their documentation. But you could have fallen into the same trap where you just occasionally updating to the latest version of Trivi and ended up with a duff exe somewhere.
Well, and it goes back to that same problem you always have with SBOMs is you end up with an index that tells you something, but figuring out what exactly it tells you is often half the battle.
Well, see the number of audits you get that just look at the initial version string of an application and don't look at a patch set. of something that's been backported into an old version of a distro, as an example there, right? This is all very flawed and very complicated.
Software is hard? I would have never thought that, huh?
I feel like CI/CD is just the worst, though. Like, it feels like it just kind of dropped all the software engineering principles, like don't repeat yourself and keep it simple. And now I think for a lot of companies where they don't have trivial CI/CD needs, it's like, okay, now I've got 1,000-line YAMLs in multiple repositories, all doing sort of the same thing but differently. CI/CD to me in 2026 feels broken. And I don't know. I probably don't know enough about what good looks like right now. People keep talking about Dagger. I need to research Dagger. Maybe this solves everything. But CI/CD is pulling in like a lot of different competing complicated systems. It's pulling in your code. It's pulling in your dependencies. It's pulling in base images. Then it needs to reason about security scanning. And then eventually needs to worry about your deployment target. Like the reason why this is bad is because people probably had pipelines with AWS credentials exposed for something that's doing security scanning. You shouldn't have your AWS credentials where you're running Trivy, but people probably did because that's just CI/CD, a big blobby mess of everything. And I don't like these solutions. I don't like GitHub Actions in particular is really bad because they just seem to be very, I don't know, anti-security best practice is a way to put it. But in general, the concept's not doing well, I would say, in terms of that day to security headaches that we should be reasoning about better, but aren't.
I don't know, Shane. I think I'm going to go one step further and say that we made the mistake of democratizing the build and deployment of software onto production servers to people who don't know what the hell they're doing. I think that's the problem, right? Once upon a time, you as a software developer would produce a build or throw some code over the wall, and then someone who knew what they were doing, i.e. an infrastructure engineer or a deployment engineer or someone, would scrutinize that. And they would say, well, why are you pulling in a 5-year-old version of this? Why are you dependent on this? Why are there 10 different dependencies in this that, as far as I can tell from the code, you're not consuming? I'm not putting that onto the production servers. And somewhere along the line, we lost that accountability or tried to automate it away. And as far as I'm concerned, that has opened us up to a lot of vulnerabilities just so that we can deploy faster or allow more people to click button. And I don't necessarily know whether that was the right direction in hindsight. Maybe I'm just playing Luddite here.
Men shakes his fist at DevOps.
I think I agree. I don't think this is a technical problem. I think this is an organizational problem. And the scope of that can be up to your discretion. But I've worked in big companies, I've worked in small companies. And even within the small companies, how you go about building a build artifact can differ. Or did differ. And so trying to do that at scale for, tens or hundreds of teams is a very tough job. And even with platform engineering tools, right? Someone's going to have some special use case where they don't fit, right? And then you have to either build around that or build it in, or they will often do their own thing. And then boom, you have another issue like this where someone didn't containerize or use Trivy the way they were supposed to because they don't know what they're doing. They're not a platform engineering team. And you're right back to where we started.
So we've all had a bit of a rant, especially myself. But does anyone in 2026 know what good looks like for CI/CD pipelines? Because I am at a loss.
I think Logan hit a point where people are going back to shell scripts, just back to basics, because that's what they know. It's static, right? I've also seen companies or even open source projects do this where they'll use like a make file or a just file or something to help with portability. So the same thing that builds an image or that runs a certain suite or tests your code runs the exact same locally as it does on the CI/CD pipelines. Is there an advantage of that? Is that a good reason to switch to shell scripts versus the native integrations?
I think in this particular case, it doesn't get you any further than you were before from a security point of model. Like we said earlier, if you've pulled a dodgy version of something into your folder that you're running the shell script from, if a dependency is questionable and has been compromised in some way, then the dependency is questionable and has been compromised in some way. The execution method doesn't change. Now, does it mean that you've got maybe something more similar that you can run from your workstation to in production, sure. But equally, I don't think that it would help in this particular scenario.
If you weren't using the GitHub action and were pulling down the binary in the shell script, in this specific instance, you may have been saved. But it's just incidental, really. It's the design patterns you're using. It's the verifying the things that you're pulling down, if they're staying immutable or consistent. Like it's on you to manage this complexity again, whether that's in shell scripts or GitHub Action or something else. But just depending on a line like uses Trivy action at version 1234 and saying, okay, well, now I'm secure, just isn't going to fly. You need to manage this complexity, unfortunately, which may feel like I'm going to write this in a shell script, but that's irrelevant. It's whatever the thing is, you need to understand what you're pulling in, how you're pulling it, how this can be attacked, and mitigate against that.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically the equivalent of doing no hash checking and going wget trivy.com/download/v1.
Yeah.
How do you know that you're getting the same v1 every time? You don't. It's the same problem, no matter how you orchestrate this.
And we complain about the specific implementations and maybe the way that the versioning works or whatever, but presumably at a conceptual level, the problem you were talking about with loads of people doing their own custom scripting for all of the similar things, to a degree that's improved by GitHub Actions, where somebody is packaging those up. Now, we might not like that some of those are proprietary and blah, 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 but at a conceptual level, the idea that somebody is pre-packaging steps of a CI/CD pipeline, isn't that a good thing?
Not if you can't do any validation of what version you're getting and how it's been put together, which appears to be what happened here. Everyone was pulling in this same dependency that no one had checked. And presumably that is because there isn't a way of doing this. So does it save you the work of curling the thing, checking the hashes yourself, verifying it, doing some kind of malware scan on it? Sure. But I don't necessarily think that it's a good thing from a security point of view. Shared libraries have always been a problem that we've had to solve for. And yeah, look at a Linux distro. You have to put trust in the package maintainer for that shared library. And at least in a Linux distro, there is some way of verifying that that package was published by Canonical or by Red Hat or whoever it is. But in this model of GitHub Actions, there doesn't seem to be one, unless you're using the hash of the Git commit, which is not what Microsoft tell you to do.
Yeah, but that's a tool issue, and it's a lack of understanding of how to use that tool, right? I would say my understanding of GitHub Actions is that, to me, they actively discourage using safe patterns. So as a result, if I am to use GitHub Actions, I have that bias in mind. I understand that system and the security risks of that system, and I will use it appropriately. But that's true of any other system I would depend on.
But that's you, and that's someone who has an interest in this, right? That isn't most developers just stringing together a pipeline and clicking and dragging stuff in, or copying and pasting something they found in Copilot into their spec file. Because let's face it, that's how a lot of this stuff gets built.
Yep.
People copy and paste stuff from Copilot or Stack Exchange until they get a deploy that works.
GitHub has a lot to answer for this system and how it's been designed. I think the idea of it being tied to the way Git works was maybe clever to begin with, but is really problematic. And you're right, Gary. I think lots of engineers are not going to understand the implications of what they do when they say, I want this thing in this version. They're going to expect something immutable, and they're not going to get that, and they will be bitten. And I am annoyed at GitHub over this.
We're treating a third-party dependency for CI/CD without the infrastructure and the tooling to do so. And we have that for code. That's why we can treat code as code and build artifacts, and we can do that. But for a third-party dependency for CI, we're not there yet. And that's a platform level thing we have to fix. Well, Microsoft has to fix, and I don't think they're going to.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, right? I was being slightly facetious earlier when I said that we didn't put the grown-ups in charge when we moved to CI/CD. But also, you're right, Sean. GitHub and some of these providers have a lot to answer for not putting the guardrails in place that, as sysadmins 10, 15 years ago, we would have put in place around our production systems. And there ought to be some checking that the thing I'm pulling in is the thing that I intended to pull in at the point I published my spec file or whatever, at least. If something changes there, if something in an upstream repository for any dependency changes, I want to be notified about it before I pull it down and produce a potentially vulnerable build. And that does feel like something that should be the responsibility of the platform that is providing the marketplace to pull in the dependencies.
With cooldowns, don't just pull in the latest stuff because it's the latest stuff. Let it be there a week or two. That way you don't get exploited versions, because that's also bit me so many times.
So, Sean, I have some thoughts on the cooldowns point specifically. I can sort of see it, and it's a little bit like the kind of safe deployment approaches that a lot of enterprises take to roll changes out through their estate just to make sure that they're limiting their blast radius. But as a general kind of security paradigm, I'm not so sure about it, right? Because you're deliberately delaying any security fixes hitting your environment for 2 weeks, just as much as you are delaying your chance that someone's had a supply chain attack on that and that you will pick it up because it's in the media or whatever faster because you've got that 2-week window that other people don't.
So your concern is that a cooldown period doesn't fix everyone's problems? Because I definitely agree with that.
I mean, my concern is that you are deliberately exposing yourself to 2 weeks of vulnerabilities just to try and protect yourself against the situation that somebody has had their entire supply chain compromised and that you will find out about that within 2 weeks.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. It's not a hard rule. Cooldowns apply differently to different things, right? For a CI/CD template, you might want to wait a couple of weeks, maybe that 2-week period. But maybe for a critical dependency, you only want to wait like 1 or 2 days. Even an hour is enough to prevent you from getting exposed to some sort of critical security. I mean, a lot of like the JS environment, the JavaScript environment, I mean, they get malicious packages released, and then within the hour, they're rolled back. So a shorter time span might be feasible for something of that scope. I think it really depends on what you're planning to cool down to. What dependency are you trying to keep up to date? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And if you're talking about something like a security scanner in your CI/CD pipeline, that's got a very different kind of security exposure than something that's sitting on the internet getting hit by random traffic. So I can kind of see the balance in different situations. I just wanted to sort of flag that I don't think you get that free, right? Like, a lot of people want to be the last one on the train until they want to be the first one to get the fix as well. And you know, you can't have both.
Well, in the case of Trivy, the maximum exposure window was the GitHub action, and it was 12 hours. So you wouldn't have had to wait anywhere close to 2 weeks. It just would depend on whether you ran the action in a 12-hour window, which maybe you did, maybe you didn't.
Yeah, it's all about managing complexity. That's what we stated at the beginning, and it holds true to the end of this conversation. It's not free. You can't just automate it away. You have to actually put thought into this and not trust it to somebody else.
So I think we've concluded that you don't get anything for free, unfortunately. But what you can do is send us any questions or comments to show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.